Yeah, so here we're going to do a bit of a modified Kermie Cam, but we're going to add some audio. And we're going to start off here doing a little bit of a cockpit check. I always start off and I kind of sweep the cockpit from left to right. And back here on the far side, we've got the tail wheel lock and unlock. The tail wheel is full swivel. Right now it's in the unlocked position. And to lock it, we would basically line the airplane up straight ahead, and then we would move it through the detent into the lock position. It would hold it back there, kind of wiggle our butt a little bit, and I would feel it lock. And we basically take off and land with it in the lock position. And anytime we're either taxiing to S-turn or to move it around in the hangar, we always leave it in the unlocked position. This here is the rudder trim tab, and as you can see, if you roll it clockwise forward, you get a little bit of right rudder trim, and backwards for left rudder trim. And back here up in the cockpit, now we're going to focus on the throttle quadrant. And the T obviously is the throttle. Forward of that is actually the blower, and it says supercharger, and it's in the low position at this point. And if we were ever going to put it into high blower, which would basically take the existing blower, spin it at a faster RPM, kind of like going from first to second gear in a car, once you got the altitude, you would bring the throttle back a little bit. You would shift it into high blower, it would spin faster, then you would adjust the throttle up in the RPM, and it basically gives you, takeoff power up to a higher altitude. Here we've got the mixture control. Right now we're in idle cutoff. This is how we shut the engine off. As you can see, forward of that, all the way forward, would be full rich, which we would use for takeoff. Auto rich we would use for, maybe climb and stuff like that. Basically, I think we use full rich. Once we get it into cruise, we brought the throttle back within the power settings for cruise, for manifold pressure and RPM. We would then go to auto lean. That would give us the maximum performance for cruising around. And then before we come into land, anytime we come into land, take off, we always go to full rich. Down here at the bottom, we've got basically a friction, and to keep the throttle from sliding back, like when we have to put the landing gear up manually with our right hand, we swap our left hand over to fly with the control stick, and we don't want the throttle to be creeping back, so we can adjust the friction there, and basically we set it to where the throttle can be moved with relative ease, but in a way that if you let it go, it would not creep. And back here, this is actually the propeller control, and the handle there, if you pull it up, you would do it. You make course changes in the RPM, and basically it would decrease the RPM, as you can see on the label there. And if you push it all the way down, that's what we would use for takeoff and landing. Now this here, you could actually, it's got a little small gear there, and where you make course changes with the lever, you could actually make little fine adjustments by twisting that knob and tweaking it, 10 or 15 RPM. So here we are looking back at the left side of the cockpit again, and now we're going to look at the elevator trim, the fuel, and the fuel tank control. Okay, so here, this handle up here that says push and pull open, there's actually two fuel tanks in the duck. The upper one is 65 gallons, the lower one is 125 gallons. And what you do is the upper one is kind of acts a little bit like a reserve, and so you'll take off and land on the main tank. And what I'll usually do on a cross country, the thing will be closed, and it will close off a dump valve between the upper tank and the lower tank. And so I will fly for an hour and a half out of the lower tank. And if I wanted to, at some point, if I wanted to refill the lower tank, I would pull that red handle back. It would basically open the dump valve, and that 65 gallons of fuel in the upper tank would drain to the 125 gallon lower tank. Here's our fuel selector. Right now it's in the off position, and as you can see, the main tank over on the right, detent, would be 125 gallons. The aux tank would be 65 gallons. So you've got the option of basically using fuel out of the main tank, or you could use it out of the aux tank. You've got the option of always running out of the main tank and opening the upper valve there and just dumping the aux tank fuel into the main tank. Now here we've got the elevator trim, and as you can see, there's a knob that basically runs around that'll give you nose up and nose down, and there's a little indicator there that tells you basically where it is. You would use the indicator prior to takeoff to basically adjust it, pretty close to the neutral position, depending on what your load is, if you've got a passenger or not. And that comes from basically experience. But mainly if you were landing and taking off or something, you might adjust it with a little bit of nose up for taking off in the water or something like that. But I think I basically set it for 0. Here we are back on the left side, and actually you can see up there on the top of the manufacturer placard up there, and Grumman had built the Grumman Ducks up to the J2F 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There was different models and stuff, and finally they got wrapped up in Hellcat production and other things, and they basically designated this airplane as a J2F6, and it was built by Columbia, which I understand was on Long Island, basically across the street from the Grumman factory. Here we've got the main panel. Starting on the left, we've got our mag switch, which is currently in the off position. There's a left mag and a right mag, and if the switch was all the way over to both would be operating. And of course, before takeoff, we do a mag check. We check each mag independently to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to. And with the both mags, when you are running it on both and you do a power check and you go over to one mag or the other, you're looking for a drop about 50 to 75 RPM. Any more than that, you might need to clean the plugs or clear it out, by increasing the throttle and running it for a little while. But basically, the reason you have 2 mags, one of them's a safety factor, but the other one is exactly for the reason that when you drop from both mags to one mag, you lose a little bit of RPM, because what's happening is you're getting a more efficient burning pattern in the cylinder with 2 spark plugs as opposed to 1. So hence you're getting a little bit more power plus a safety factor of a backup mag. Here we've got our airspeed, which is in knots. All the Navy airplanes in America, did their airspeeds in knots. And down here we've got our directional gyro, and down below that's a little knob where we could actually adjust the setting for whatever our wet compass would say. Yeah, so here we've got the wet compass. Down below we've got our turn and slip indicator, and basically if you're turning left or right in instrument conditions, regardless of whether you're coordinated or not, the little needle will tell you if you're turning left or right, and the little ball down below there is kind of in a curved glass tube, and it'll tell you whether or not it's coordinated. And if you were turning to the left and the ball was basically sliding out to the right, you would be skidding, okay? And it would be similar to going around a bank turn in a car and feeling like you were being leaning to the outside of the turn. And if you weren't going fast enough around a bank turn, then the ball would go to the left and you would be basically slipping into the turn. And so the term slip for sliding inside, the ball would be on the left side in the case of a left-hand turn, and the ball would be out on the right side. In the case of a left-hand turn, you would actually be skidding. But think of it about going around a bank turn in a car that was designed at a specific speed, and if you were going too fast, you would be skidding to the outside of the turn, and if you were going too slow, you would be slipping to the inside of the turn. Here we've got our altimeter, and if you look over to the right, there's a little bit of a window there with some barometric pressures. It looks like it's about 2994 kind of set right now. And basically, if you were flying along in on a cross country and you were changing pressures, different places, you could talk to a controller, find out what the local pressure is. If you go to land at an airport, they always tell you what the field pressure is, and you would adjust your altimeter to that new pressure, so your altimeter would be correct. Right now we've got it set on 0, and pretty much any time I do any flying around Fantasy of Flight and I'm only going to take off and land a Fantasy of Flight, instead of wanting to know that I'm taking off of a runway that's 144 feet above sea level, I would rather see it at 0, because then I know where the ground is. Down here below we've got the artificial horizon, and basically this would be used for instrument conditions, and we've got a knob down on the right there that would basically cage and uncage that. This operates off of vacuum pressure, and once the gyros spin up, it might be a little lopsided. When you're flying along straight and level, you could actually cage that and uncage it to basically adjust the horizon to the bars where the little airplane is like kind of on the horizon, and there's a little knob down below there that could adjust the height of that little set of wings relative to the horizon, which is the longer bar. And like I said, that's used basically for instrument conditions. Over here we've got our 8-day clock, and I'm pretty sure the reason I call it an 8-day clock is because if you wind it up all the way, it'll run for 8 days. Over here we've got kind of part of our starting system, and the little engine primer knob to the upper side is on, and that's basically it's an electrical driven pump that primes fuel directly into the cylinders, through some little priming tubes. And down below there, we've got the starter system. This has what they call an inertial starter. Right now it's in the off position. If we flick the switch to the right, you can actually hear the starter winding up. It's got some weights in there. It builds up some inertia. And then at some point when we get enough kind of RPM, we kind of tell by the sound of how fast it's spinning. Then we would say clear prop. We would flick that switch to the left where it says mesh. It would engage the starter and it would spin the engine over. And hopefully with the mag switch on and maybe a little bit of priming, it would start on the first time we meshed it. Okay, now down here we're basically going down to the lower panel, and the little instrument down there we've got highlighted as basically a modern instrument, and it's a VOR. There are VOR stations placed around the United States that send out beams of radials. So if you were due north of a station, you were tuned into it, you would be on the 360 radial. And if you were on the east side of the station, you would be on the 090 radial, and there's an indicator on there that tells you whether you're going to the station or from the station. So this is used for navigation purposes. And the little knob down there on the left there basically allows you to adjust the compass rose that's around there and put you on the radial that you want to stay on, and then you could use that for your navigation. And then there's a little needle that's vertical there that'll tell you whether you're left or right or one way or the other relative to the radial that you've got set up there at the top. And here we've got it looks like an old radio, but it's actually a modern radio compared to what you would have seen in World War II. I believe this is an old KX-175 King, and on the left side is the COM, and on the right side is the frequencies for the VOR, which we just talked about just left of the radio there. And over here on the right side, you can't see it very well, but basically there's a little T-handle there. Here we can see it a little bit better, and that little T-handle there is your carb air. Right now it says push to direct on a little placard to the right, and it's pushed in, so we basically got direct air or cold air. And if we pull that handle out, in the case of being on a dusty airstrip, or possibly this might be connected to carburetor heat as well. If we had some icing in the carburetor, we would pull that out and add warmer air to the carburetor. So, and then as you can see, you can twist it to the left or to the right, and you can lock and unlock it. And then up top here, we've got kind of basically a checklist. I'm not sure if this was actually part of the original World War II original placards and equipment, but basically it was added when I had the airplane, so we could use that as a checklist. And now we're going to go down to the lower panel. In this instrument here, we've got the cylinder head temperature gauge. And one of the things that we look for before we take off or we taxi, really before we taxi, I wait till I get at least 100 degrees centigrade, so that's 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And as you can see, the red line for the cylinder head temp is basically 260 degrees. Of course, this is only connected to one cylinder, but they usually choose like what would be considered the hottest cylinder, and they would attach it to that. So the rest of them should be running at least that or possibly cooler. Here we've got our manifold pressure gauge, and as you can see, the barometric pressure where we're sitting right now is basically 30 inches of manifold pressure, and that measures the pressure of the air. And when we do our engine run up, this airplane has a supercharger, which you can actually see. The red line on the supercharger for takeoff is about 42.5 inches, the little red line over there. And we would actually, when we would do our run up, we would try and get to 30 inches and then look at the RPM to see what kind of RPM that 30 inches was giving us, and we would do our mag check at 30 inches as well. Unfortunately, on the Duck, it's a little bit tail light, And if you try and go up to 30 inches, the tail starts coming off the ground. So I do the best I can. If I've got a person in the back, I can get a little bit more out of it. But, we basically do our mag check and cycle the propeller at whatever we can get. Here we've got the water rudder, and basically back where the tail wheel is, there's two little doors that basically surround the tail wheel. And normally when we fly, that's pushed in because we don't really need it, and it connects into the rudder system, so there's a little bit of additional friction. But when we land in the water, what we'll do is I'll put the rudders kind of in neutral. I will pull that handle out. It'll engage the water rudder system into the rudder cable system, and what happens is when I push the right rudder, there's one door that comes out the right side that basically acts as a rudder on the right side, and then if I push you go back to neutral, it comes back in, and as I start going to the left, it pushes out a little bit of a door on the left side. And so it's kind of interesting. It's not it's not like one rudder goes back and forth, one goes to the right and one goes to the left. And then obviously before we take off in the water, we would disconnect this, we would push that back in, and we would live without the fact that we didn't have a water rudder, because by that point we're pretty much faced into the wind, and once we start putting in the power, then we can use the aerodynamic rudder on the back. Here we've got the tachometer. As you can see, our takeoff maximum red line is 2,600 RPM. And there's kind of a yellow in there that, you wouldn't want to cruise at that. That would be kind of like for climb and that kind of stuff, and we would be probably in the auto-rich range there on the mixture. And then once we got the cruise, say below 2,100 RPM, I think in the Duck I usually cruise around 1,900 RPM or something like that, and about 25, 26 inches of manifold pressure. And once we got to that cruising setting, we would bring the mixture back to auto lean. Here we've got what they call our 3-in-1 gauge, and at the top there you can see the oil temperature. And generally what I do before I taxi out is I let the airplane warm up after I've started it to about 40 degrees on the oil temp. As I mentioned before, I want to see 100 degrees on the cylinder head temp. And before we do any kind of a run-up, we want to make sure we've got at least 40 degrees. And as you can see, the red line there is about 105 degrees. So we want to make sure that the oil's cooling below that. And then down to the lower left, we've got our oil pressure gauge. Once you first start the engine, the first thing you want to look for is to make sure that the oil pressure comes up. As soon as it starts, you want to look at the oil pressure gauge to make sure it's working. When it first starts and the oil's cold and it's thicker, it'll actually read a little bit higher. At the same RPM at a higher temperature, it'll read a little bit lower. And normally when you're cruising, as you can see, we want to see at least 55 pounds per square inch up to about 90, and that's where you want to see it when you're flying. But when you come in, you land, you bring the throttle back, you're idling, you're taxiing around, it'll go down into that into the yellow range there. But the yellow range is really more for when you're cruising up at a higher setting. And then down and to the right, we've got our fuel pressure gauge, and as you can see, the around 14 to 15 pounds is kind of the green. Down below here, we've got our vacuum suction gauge, which operates the directional gyro and the artificial horizon. And down here we've got our fuel gauge. As you can see over on the right, we've got our lower tank, which is 125 gallons, and over to the left we've got our aux tank, which is 65. And continuing our sweep from left to right, we're now over on the right side of the cockpit. Up here is basically the control for the canopy, and it slides forward and backward with that handle to slide the canopy forward and backward. And you can actually see that there's 3 notches. This one is pretty close to the canopy being wide open. It's not exactly, but at some point there's a notch very close to where it's at right now, and you could basically, for takeoff, if you wanted to leave it open, you could push the handle down in that notch. If you look up in the front there, you can actually see another notch. That little notch there, once it's set and the canopy's locked, has about 4 inches of the canopy open, and then if you wanted to lock it completely, you would open it up, you would push that handle all the way forward, and there's another notch there about 4 inches forward of that forward notch there. So there's 3 notches to set 3 canopy positions. And down below here we've got our typical Grumman how to get the wheels up manual system, which is kind of like the Wildcat. And if you look in the back there, it says to raise and lower. This is kind of like a ratchet, like on a ratchet wrench. And so if you want to go one way, you click the lower, and then you would basically spin the handle counterclockwise. You can see where it says lower with an arrow forward. Now, right now, obviously, we're on the ground. The landing gear is down and locked, so we're in the lower position because we did that after before we landed the last time. And then on takeoff, I would take off. The first thing I would do would be to click that little ratchet handle there from lower to raise, and then I would begin to turn the handle crank in the clockwise direction to raise the landing gear. I believe on the Grumman Duck it takes 46 turns, and it's interesting, the original landing gear here, you can see there's kind of an added lengthening to the crank there. The original crank is a cast piece, and this other piece has been added around it. Well, before I got the airplane, the original wheels and brakes I understood were like worthless, especially if you got them wet, and they just would hardly work. So the owner that I bought the airplane from had gone in and found some like later jet type wheels or something, and they were disc type brakes, and they basically they cut down from 5 discs to I think 2 or 3 discs, but still the wheels ended up weighing maybe significantly more on both sides, and total there was such an increase in weight that they had to lengthen the handle for leverage. And it's interesting because of that, I've just lived with it in this airplane since I bought it. When I take off, the gear is so heavy that I physically cannot crank the gear up after I get about maybe 7 or 8 turns. It's so heavy for me to crank that what I have to do is I actually have to pull the nose of the airplane up, and when I get it up to the point where I crank it, I pull the nose up, then I shove the nose forward to get a little bit of not negative G, but to take the positive G so it's less, and then I crank like mad for about 10 turns, and then of course by that time I've had to settle in again, and normally I have to raise the landing gear on this particular duck in 3 sections. The first one I can crank about 8 turns, then I got to raise the nose, I got to shove the nose forward, crank about another 10 turns, and then once I get it past a certain point I can crank it up all the way. And part of my checklist is to always warn my passenger that it's about to happen. So it looks like we're taking off, we're doing some whoopie-doos. And up on the front here we basically have we've got the landing gear indicator where each wheel is located. There's basically kind of a cable that goes down to each wheel that's indicated there, and of course you've got one for the right, one for the left, and it's an indicator that kind of shows the location of the gear. But what you're looking for bringing it up and bringing it down is to make sure that the hand crank won't go any further. And back here we basically got our electrical panel. In the front there we've got our voltmeter, which would tell us basically what the battery voltage is. It's a 24-volt system, and whenever the generator's running and we're flying, it's probably going to show about 28.5 volts, so it shows that the battery's charging. So the first switch is the battery, second one is the generator on and off. You've got a fuel pumps behind it, then you basically got some lights, the next 3. There's one back there that says pre-oil, and we basically put a pre-oiler, since we don't fly the airplane on a regular basis. Before we always fly the airplane, a lot of the airplanes, we basically run the pre-oiler for a while, because what we want to do is we want to make sure we've got oil to the crankshaft mainly. And once we start the engine, we're immediately looking for that oil pressure to make sure the engine gets it as soon as possible. And then just behind that we've got the radio master switch, and the one in the back says off, and it's probably not connected to anything at this point. And there's basically down there on that little panel there's a rheostat that would probably adjust some of the cockpit lights down to the lower right, and then there's some fuse switches, the little red switches there on that panel on the side. And we're ready to go fly. Okay, so here we're setting ourselves into position, looking for the temps to make sure that we've got the at least 100 degrees on the cylinder head temp gauge, at least 40 degrees on the oil temp, and check out the mixture to full rich, checking the mags are on both, making sure that the boost pump is on, Got 40 degrees on the oil temp. Checking the cylinder head temp. So I'm basically warming everything up, adjusting the altimeter to basically 0. Now we're going to do the run up. So I'm pushing it up to where I can get as much power to where the tail doesn't come. But at least in this one, you're not going to go forward and hit the prop. You just go up on your nose. So I basically, I'm checking the propeller. So I pull the propeller control up to decrease. I'm allowing the prop to cycle to more coarse pitch. And one of the reasons we do this 2 or 3 times is to try and get warm oil up into the propeller dome. So we cycle it a few times because it basically replaces the oil, it brings in some new oil, and we're trying to get the warm oil up to where initially, if we didn't do anything, it would still be cold oil. There we go, I'm adjusting that again. You can't really see the tachometer down there, but I'm basically cycling the propeller. I'm pushing it back down. I'm setting the throttle friction there. I think I just turned the boost pump on. I just checked the boost of the fuel pressure gauge. Now I'm checking the mags. Okay, I'm going to adjust the canopy here. So I've basically got it full closed right now. Checking everything, doing my left to right thing, making sure I got the fuel selector on the main tank, checking the fuel gauges, all the electrical switches, just kind of like I said, doing my left to right cockpit sweep. Just check the controls. You saw me moving the controls around, making sure everything was full and clear. Now I'm basically lining up. I still got the tail wheel unlocked. Once I line it up, I'm going to wiggle my butt a little bit, and I'm going to put it in the locked position. Okay, so we want to take off. Now I realize I either need to take off with the canopy full open or full closed, because what you're going to see here, I've got it open about 4 inches, and unfortunately with the longer landing gear manual crank up, it hits the handle for the canopy. So you'll see I'm going to end up closed. So I've just cranked the little ratchet. See, now I got to put it forward because it's hitting that handle. That's because of the longer handle. So I get it to a certain point, and then you're going to watch the nose is going to come up. Now I've basically gone from takeoff power to climb power. This airplane is so loud on takeoff. It's louder than a T6 because this is the only airplane that has a direct drive 1820. Normally it's a geared engine like on a B-17. But so I'm getting the nose up. Now I'm shoving it forward and I'm cranking it. I'm dropping the nose down by pushing the stick forward. Now I'm going to have to do it again. I got it as far as I can go. Okay, there we go. I've got it past the deal. So now you can see the indicators coming back on the right side, and I got it to the point where I can crank it up all by myself. So once, I'm not looking for the up indicator, I'm looking for the crank to stop. And like I said, I think it's about 46 turns. There we go. So that's there. Now I'm going to, coming up to kind of a cruise thing, so we're about 900 feet right now, 125 miles an hour. Adjusting the RPM and the power. Like I said, I think I usually cruised around 1900 RPM and about 25, 26 inches of manifold pressure. Turn the boost pump off. Check down. I would look down to make sure that the fuel pressure was, see I put it in the little notch there, the canopy crank. I would look down to make sure the fuel pressure didn't fluctuate. It was still working good, but I would know for sure if the engine quit, and then I would turn the boost pump back on. So right now it's operating off the engine-driven fuel pump. So we're making a right-hand kind of sweep around Fantasy of Flight after we've taken off. Fantasy of Flight's off to the upper right. It is a beautiful airplane. This is I think a face only a mother could love, but I love it. So here we are cruising around, about just under 1,100 feet. Turning to the right so you can see the The little slip and ball indicator is indicating a right turn. Perfectly coordinated. This airplane wallows around so much, and part of the reason is it's kind of like a pterodactyl, because what happens is you've got that aerodynamic front nose forward of the center of gravity. You've got a big tail in the back there, but the hull acts as an aerodynamic balance, kind of like on an aileron on a Fokker triplane. And what happened is about almost 135 miles an hour cruise, indicates 140 if I let it settle in. And basically, so this airplane wallows around left to right when you're cruising along. It's kind of hard to make a coordinated turn. Part of the problem is because that hull forward of the center of gravity is acting kind of like an aerodynamic balance. And you can kind of see it there, where the hull, if you turned it to the left, it would want to turn more to the left. If you turn it to the right, it would want to turn more to the right. Fantasy of flight down there. There's our runways. You kind of see our seaplane potential base down there. Making a left turn, water tower. There's Fantasy of flight. Connie down there. Cruising along. Yeah, I bought this airplane a long time ago. This was my second warbird, I believe. The first warbird I bought was the P-51D Mustang Cripes Almighty. Well, no, that was the third. The first one I bought was an AT-6. Then the Mustang was the second one. I bought about 1979. And this was my third one, I believe. I bought it in about 1980, probably 1981. From John Seidel, and I picked it up, I believe, out of Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. And of course, at this time, I was in the Stark Weeks Air Museum in Miami. I was thinking about it. I just started collecting airplanes, and we eventually opened in 1985. Here I am. You see the altimeter dropping, coming in for a pass. Turned into the right. Airspeed's a little over 140 miles an hour, 400 feet. Probably the left side of the runway here. Make sure I don't scrape the belly on the treetops. Now my GoPro is basically, I'm wearing as a Kermie Cam, helmet cam kind of a thing. Is normally, it's a couple inches above where my vision is, just because of where I'm wearing the camera. So it's a little bit better view from my perspective. Turn around here over some of the local property in the orange groves. Setting up for another pass. I kind of like always do the same little, when I used to do airplane of the day, I always used to do the same pattern. I'd kind of make them fly by, and I'd kind of show the top of the airplane and then the bottom. So here I'm probably going to make a left turn, kind of an air show pass. There we go. Everybody's on the top of the airplane. There's the Canopy. It's actually quite a beautiful airplane. I got to tell you, when I first picked this airplane up, the guy took me. I basically bought it. And John Seidel was up in the front, and I was in the back. And in the back seat, there's a. I guess I'm coming in to land in the water, so I push the mixer forward, make sure that the gear is up, landing on water. I always say that in any kind of a seaplane. I go, gear is up, landing on water. Gear is down, landing on land. That's always one of my checklist items that I always say and reconfirm. Anyway, so I was in the back seat, and the back seat of the stick comes in and out. It was designed for the observer in case the pilot got incapacitated. So it wasn't really designed for flying a lot. It's shorter and it's way forward. And when he took me out for a ride and he said, "You got controls?" I flew it around. I thought, "Oh my God, I cannot believe I bought this airplane." And I thought, "Oh, this thing flies horrible." Then when I got up the front, it was totally different. So here we're coming in, clearing the power lines, and coming in over I-4. Got to be at least above 17 feet, FAA regulations. Throttle's all the way back, slowing down. Slowing down, holding it back, basically not quite a 3-point. It's a little bit of a level. Here we go, a little bit of a tail cam. And, oh God, it's such a great airplane. It's really more at home on the water than it is on the land. Although it doesn't, because it's just got those little one water rudder, and at some point when I come settle down, you'll see me pull the handle out. So I just engage the water rudder. Okay, so I pulled it out, and you can see it wiggling. So now I'm turning to the right. Now I'm going to push to the left, and I'm going to watch. It's going to turn to the left. See, it doesn't. It's not like a on the ground when you're hitting with the brakes, but you know, it's functional. It does its job. And then before takeoff, I'm going to put that back in because I don't want that as part of the. It kind of slows down the, you know, the rudder travel. So I'm turning around. It sits pretty low in the water when you're moving forward. And I got to tell you, I had never been in a seaplane in my life. I had a friend that flew seaplanes in World War II, and he told me what it was like landing on the water. And I'd bought the airplane. I was out flying over Biscayne Bay with somebody. I was given a ride in the back, and all of a sudden I started smelling like smoke, like electrical smoke. And I thought, oh my God. Anyway, my first landing ever in a seaplane was in a Grumman Duck in Biscayne Bay. I did great, and I took off too. Anyway, so here we are taking off. In any kind of chop, the water comes up over the bottom wing and almost over the top wing. So I basically looking for about 65 knots is kind of the breakaway deal, speed. There we're up. You can see the water rudders on the back there. The tail of those when the water's coming off. And taking off. I think Phil's down there filming off the dock somewhere. There he is. Kind of doing a little flyby to make sure I clear fantasy of flight. There's the Connie and the B-25. I got to tell you, when I was flying this out of the Weeks Air Museum, Tamiami Airport in Miami, it was really cool. I mean, I was such an anomaly on the airport, and I had a great rapport with the control tower. And there were a lot of times I would go out in the Grumman Duck, and I would go fly around, you know, southwest of the airport. And eventually, sometimes I would come back, and once I got within 5 miles and I was supposed to call the tower, I would just basically get on the radio and go, quack, quack, 5 southwest. And they would say, Grumman Duck, 1214 November, clear to land. It was really fun. Those were great times. And you can see that we're turning to the left, and the ball is perfectly coordinated. And let me tell you, man, it wallows around a lot. I think we're going to make another flyby here. And we're going to go right down the middle of the runway. Kicking up speed to a blistering, probably 145 to 50 miles an hour. Down between the trees. Seems like you're going pretty fast when you go down between those trees. It's pretty cool. So we're going to pull up. I think we're going to land out of this one. So I've swapped over to the left, my left hand flying, so I've got the throttle friction, so the throttle set at a power setting. I've moved the lever to the down position on a little ratchet for the landing gear thing. And now going down is not a problem. In fact, you don't want to lose control of that handle because it would probably spin around and break your arm if you hit it, if you let it go. So you can see the little indicators going forward. The indicators are down. I know about when it's going to stop, and I want to make sure that I push the handle a little bit extra to make sure the gear is down and locked. Okay, mixture's full forward, checking the prop, setting everything. At some point I would have set the boost pump on. Checking everything, the gear is down, going in on land. And as you can see, you can't see where you're going in the duck. So a lot of this is by feel. It's by doing a little bit of S-turning till the last minute, pointing the nose down, lining everything up, and then I lose everything. I always 3-point the duck. I 3-point everything unless I've got somebody in front of me. And as you can see, I'm holding it back, holding it back, holding it back. And you basically, ideally, you want to try, you know, like basically stalling the airplane or just above that when you touch down, and then the airplane's not going to bounce. So you just develop a finesse over the years of kind of figuring out that is for each airplane. And at some point, I brought the mixture back to, I think, auto lean. I'm going to disconnect the tail wheel here at some point, unlock it so I can S-turn. Push the prop forward, setting up for the next flight. Probably readjusted the elevator trim. Right now I've disconnected the tail with this point for sure because I'm S-turning. So you have to turn to the right to see to the left and vice versa. Taxiing in over to where we have our fuel in our little museum light hangar currently. There's our B-25. And I shut it off with the idle cutoff. Quack, quack. Okay, we got the idle cutoff. I'm going to turn the fuel to off. Still in the unlock position so the guys can tow it for the tail wheel. Mags are off, and the master battery switch and the generator off, radio's off. So what I always remember is mags, master, fuel. That's what I always shut off when I get out of every airplane. So that's the Duck. Pretty cool. I love this plane.
Life is good.